very much for your very pertinent observations. I respect your comments. Yes, Dr. J.P. Narayan, I'm sorry that I had to wait for some time. Yes, thank you, thank you.
Honorable Speaker, I think there's a lot of gloom in this room as well as in the country about our parliamentary democracy. So I would like to start off with something positive. In some ways we haven't done badly at all. I think it's important to remind ourselves of that before we berate ourselves in our democracy and our political institutions. Of course there's much that's wrong. But if you go by 4 yardsticks that really allow us to claim to be a functioning democracy, I think we have done pretty well. Competitive elections, we certainly have competitive elections, and we have thrown out governments persistently, and you so rightly pointed out in 1977. I don't think anybody really believed it would happen. We all dreamed it would happen. We didn't really believe it would happen. I was a young man at the time, hoping that the tyranny would end, and the way the people responded was magnificent. So competitive elections. Political freedoms which are so necessary for this competition to be real. With all our distortions, I think there is real political freedom in this country. All of us can say pretty much what we like. I don't think there's real fear of being jailed or mugged or worse in this country. The winners do not punish the losers merely because they happen to be the losers. We have many of our neighboring countries and elsewhere where you may lose your head, not merely freedom, merely because you lost the election. And the elected government is truly in power, not a coterie or a junta. I think these 4 are of inestimable value, and we should recognize those before we look at the problems. So I would like to specifically state these things. Not that we do not know, but I think we have to have more rounded appreciation of what's happening in democracy. The second broad point I'd like to make is, increasingly, democracy is so delegitimized in this country that many people are tempted to look at illiberal, undemocratic solutions. For instance, there is a belief increasingly that the rise of the unelected, that is better for the country than the elected. I think that's a very dangerous delusion. Many people have written books about the unelected, written books about the constitutional organs. The Honorable former Chief Justice, he had the courage to state that there were some distortions because the Parliament, for a variety of reasons, yielded space. In this case to the judiciary, it was somewhat delicate, but I think I should be somewhat more indelicate and then state it openly. You have been stating it very repeatedly. Yielded space, and I think it's a perversion of our democracy and constitution to think that the judges can name their own successors. No functioning democracy in the world allows that to happen. It is very clearly, unquestionably a perversion of the constitution. That the lawmakers did not have the courage and the gumption to stand together, even though they believe it passionately, to stand together and correct the distortion is actually a very sad commentary on the way our democracy is functioning, and that must be corrected soon. Otherwise, increasingly, we will fall prey to the temptation to believe that a non-democratic organ of state is always a better organ. The middle class tends to believe that a politician by definition is bad, politics by definition is utterly dangerous and criminal and villainous, and therefore anything non-political is perfectly acceptable. There's nothing more dangerous than that. Having said that, you raised the issue of what happened in Parliament during the confidence vote. And I, along with millions of our countrymen, am deeply grateful to you for invoking the inherent provision by which the House can expel its own members for conduct unbecoming of the members. It was invoked only twice before you did that. I think one case was H.G. Mudgal, before the first Parliament was elected, in fact. The second was when Mrs. Gandhi herself was expelled for a contempt of the House or for misleading the Parliament or Parliamentary Committee. But otherwise, nobody dared to do that. You did that. But I would like to emphatically submit that the roots of the problem are not technical. They are not in the House. What is seen in the House is merely a symptom of the much deeper malaise. Dr. Shashi Tharoor mentioned that. Dr. Bhaskar Rao mentioned that. And the Honorable Member of Parliament, Mr. Ranjita, mentioned that. I think we should go into the core of that issue. There are three big symptoms of this deeper malaise, and I would like this body to look at that very dispassionately. It's not enough to simply say things are bad and express our angst. The first is the divisions. The Secretary General mentioned in his presentation initially, and you mentioned that, the fractured politics and the divisions, the way things are happening in Maharashtra now, the Northeast, the sub-regional passions aroused persistently in many parts of the country, or the way Delhi itself was paralyzed, the national capital was paralyzed in a country as large as 1 billion people because of a Gujjar Meena agitation. It could happen again tomorrow. We only temporarily pushed it under the carpet. It could happen tomorrow again on the caste issue of reservations. You can clearly see political commerce made out of these fractious divisions in society. And it makes abundant short-term political sense for politicians and parties to play up to these tendencies. And there's a systemic problem we cannot ignore. There's no point telling them to be patriotic, to be national, when to be national means to lose the election. So how do we create an environment in which that changes? Question one. Two, I'm grateful to Dr. Bhaskar Rao for raising the important question. Mr. Shyam Benegal, like many well-meaning, intelligent citizens deeply concerned about democratic values in the country, the Prime Minister himself belongs to this category, is arguing for state funding. Dr. Manmohan Singh repeatedly said that. With due respect, sir, that simply is not the solution at all. The concept is sound. The problem is, as Dr. Bhaskar Rao mentioned, in many states, the expenditure for a state legislative office, in fact, in all this discussion, we're talking about the Parliament. With due respect, Mr. Speaker, the real problem of India is in the states. The Parliament is more of a symbolic value. The governance, the good and the bad, and the politics, the good and the bad, is really in states. And therefore, any discussion to be meaningful has to really encompass the state legislatures and the way democracy is functioning there at the grassroots level. For a state legislative office, let alone a parliament, Lok Sabha office, the typical expenditure in my state of Andhra Pradesh by a major party would be of the order of 5 to 10 crore rupees. I am not exaggerating, Mr. Speaker, a bit, and you know by now very well. Every member of parliament who knows Andhra Pradesh, or Karnataka for that matter, understands that. No, he's saying it'll be more. I tend to be conservative in these numbers. In the next election in Andhra Pradesh, easily we will see an expenditure of about 15 crore rupees by at least 3 major formations for each assembly constituency in Andhra Pradesh. And that means about 4,000 crores in Andhra Pradesh alone. Most of this expenditure is not for campaigning. The reason why public funding will not work is 80 to 90% expenditure is to buy the vote straightforward with money and liquor. It does not mean that the money will guarantee election. It does not mean high expenditure guarantees election. Sometimes it does not. But it means that non-expenditure guarantees defeat. Huge expenditure has become a necessary condition but not a sufficient condition. So we must not confuse between the non-success of high expenditure for robustness of our democracy. There is a huge entry barrier which prevents ethical politics to enter. The reason why the good people do not enter is the good guys come last. They simply have very little chance of getting elected. There still are a few exceptions like Bengal, like Kerala, like Gujarat in many ways. There are still a few exceptions individually because the stature, the towering stature of an individual, you may get elected. You may still overcome these barriers. But I'm talking the overwhelming majority of members of parliament or the state legislatures in the country. The exceptions only prove the rule. We must not go by the exceptions. When money transferred to the voters and inducement is the primary determinant of the outcome, any amount of state funding will not solve the problem. And in fact, many members of parliament unfortunately are not sufficiently aware the 2003 law on electoral funding in the country is an exceptionally sound law, except that it simply is observed in the breach. Nobody cares, because if the expenditure is legitimate and fully accounted and accountable, then the law will work. If the expenditure is illegitimate and unaccounted and unaccountable, no law will work. It's as simple as that. and there's really accounted and accountable, then the law will work. If the expenditure is illegitimate and unaccounted and unaccountable, no law will work. It's as simple as that. And there's an incentive now to not operate that. And even the provisions of the existing law, like for instance, free television time. Dr. Bhaskar talked about the perversions of democracy in the United States and the huge television expenditure. And Barack Obama spent millions of dollars in 1/2 hour just 48 hours ago to go to the nation. Now in India, the lawmakers have taken care of that by guaranteeing free air time in public and private channels for recognized political parties. What happened? The rules have not been changed in order to make this simple rule operational, even when the parties have something to gain. It's an amazing development. Even after the law was enacted in 2003, we still have not framed the rules, and therefore the law is inoperative to this extent. India is one of the few countries that gives 100% tax exemption to the donors of political parties. And yet, 95% of the funds to political parties or to elections is unaccounted because nobody finds it convenient. Because the expenditure is not legitimate. And that's not what wins elections. This is all for the theoreticians and for the reformers and for the nice guys in the country, not for real politics. Therefore, we must go deeper into these issues of money and the distortions of money, power and politics, resulting in the behavior in Parliament that's merely an external symptom. Deep inside there's cancer. This headache will not be solved by merely cutting off the head or thinking of some Saridon or some analgesic. The third, of course, is freebies. It's not merely that I give money during elections. Increasingly, the members of legislature and the parties in power and opposition, they've realized that the state money itself is there as an inducement for the vote. Even if you take away a big part of that cake for private gain, you can still give a significant part for 2 rupees rice, free electricity, free color television. Which other democracy sees a color television being given free and being accepted as the norm? It's not even part of the constitutional duties of a government. At least rice you can claim that there is a reason why the poor should be supported, at least for the time being, though it's not a solution to poverty. But color television, and yet the system did not have the gumption to stand up and say, Mr. Karunanidhi, distributing television is no part of the state. The Election Commission has no guts, and I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do. I hope the Supreme Court will say, at least this is a corrupt electoral practice, because we're not going to go too far. Tomorrow I'm waiting for a day when a party will say, I will distribute 5 bottles of liquor every month to your family if only my party is elected to office. Why not? How is it different from a color television? Therefore, the freebies. Now, how do we address these issues? Some people mention the question of incentives, Mr. Speaker. Dr. Shashi Tharoor talked about the larger systemic issue, and I agree with him that there is an imperative need for clearer separation of powers. But I am much more practical than Dr. Tharoor. I know it will not happen for quite some time, and I also know that at the national level, there probably are very sound reasons why it cannot happen. North-South, Hindu-Muslim, Hindi, non-Hindi. We have so many fractures and divisions in a very complex and diverse society, why at the national level probably the country cannot invest that kind of authority in one functionary, though that functionary actually is weaker than an elected prime minister who more or less controls both the parliament and the executive branch of government. But these niceties are not adequately understood, therefore there are fears. I understand. But there are other elegant solutions to change the incentives. And the good news, I believe, is, and that's where my optimism comes from. Dr. Brahmachari talked about his optimism. My optimism is not irrational. I believe there are reasons why we must be optimistic. Good things will happen, big changes will happen, not because they are moral and they are right. Rarely does it happen so in politics. Good changes will happen when the politicians in office realize that there is a vested interest in such change, and incidentally there is a benefit to the nation. And I believe there is now such a concomitance of circumstances coming today in the country in the next few years. The national parties are losing out very badly in our perverse electoral system. Today, in the 6 largest states of India, UP, Bihar, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal and Tamil Nadu, not necessarily in that order, except in Andhra Pradesh, Congress party is a dominant player. In no other state is any of the 2 leading national parties major players. They're either non-existent virtually politically, or they're playing second fiddle to their local partners. It's an amazing development which is somehow ignored by all of us, because The parliament seems to be unaffected because of alliances and coalitions, and therefore we think this is not an unnatural development. Increasingly, as the national parties are coming below a certain threshold of vote, their seat share is falling well below their vote share. And once people realize that their vote does not translate into electoral presence, representative election, automatically that party dries up. Then you have a Hobson's choice. If you don't have an alliance with a local partner, you are zero in parliament from that state. If you have an alliance with a local partner, you are zero in the state because you don't contest in many parts of the state, and if you don't contest in politics, you don't exist. There is an extraordinarily cruel fate now hanging down the necks of the leading parties, and that's what happened in these states. Increasingly, it's happening in many other states. Therefore, the major parties, the national parties, have now a vested interest in looking at a fundamental change, not for the country, but for their own sake. And the country incidentally benefits. India is one of the handful of countries with the current electoral system. By a quirk of it, Dr. Tharoor talked about margarine versus butter when Attlee offered the presidential executive system, the clear separation of powers. But come to the first past the post system. It's an unnatural system which is accepted only by Britain and its former colonies and no other country on earth. Somehow we in India think that's the only normal political system operative in the world. Right now there are only 8 countries in the world that operate that. Even Britain's former colonies have rejected it increasingly. New Zealand has switched over to a proportionate system. Australia has a very sophisticated alternative voting system. And wonder of all wonders, Britain is giving up its own first past the post system. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, in the regional parliaments, Britain has a proportionate system. It has given up its first past the post system. In London City, 20% of Britain, the mayor is elected by a direct election. He is a presidential executive. Britain is giving it up. The British Parliament is the last institution in Britain that still sticks to this first past the post system, and Indians are the last living Englishmen, as somebody said long ago, and we stick to it like limpets. We don't realize that this is a totally unnatural thing. And this is hurt in the country because the marginal vote is all important today. It does not matter how honest you are, how capable you are, if the people's perception is that you are not likely to win, even if you are popular otherwise, you will not get the vote. It does not matter if you get 40% of the vote, or even 48% of the vote. It's the marginal vote of a few thousand that will make or break your political fate. And therefore politicians are responding to that desperate choice. It's not because they're cruel or crooked. It's easy for us to say all these politicians are crooked. It's a ridiculous notion. Politicians can be honorable, politicians can be ugly also. They have not taken a vow to destroy India. They have only taken a vow to do whatever it takes to come to power. And that's the function of politics. How can you blame that? Therefore, they are spending these vast sums in the hope of garnering the marginal vote. Because that 1,000 votes extra is the determinant of victory or defeat. And happily, it does not require a constitutional change to switch over to a proportionality model. All it means is a multi-member constituency model with a proportionality-based system. And you know some more than anybody else, the first 2 parliaments were elected in multi-member constituencies. There was no reservation of constituencies for SCs and STs in the first 2 parliaments in 52 and 57. Only because in one particular seat, Mr. V.V. Giri was unelected. He was not elected because he came number 2. The first seat was open in that seat because of a local quirk, a scheduled tribe, but a Raja scheduled tribe was elected. The second seat was reserved to a scheduled tribe. Both seats went to scheduled tribe. The parliament panicked instead of finding a rational solution. Therefore, they started reserving constituencies since 1962 onwards. We could do it through a normal law. The constitution makers were very wise. They very carefully crafted the constitution to give us space to have a multi-member proportionate representation system. There's no reason to have this kind of a first past the post system. It is merely by Representation of the People Act. Today, I believe the sickening feeling that many people get out of the first past the post system and the coalition governments and the corruption and of course the notes for vote, whatever. This gives us tremendous opportunity. Post 2009 there is tremendous fear of even more fractured coalition. The unspoken fear in the country is the sickening feeling that many people get out of the first past the post system and the coalition governments and the corruption and of course the notes for vote, whatever. This gives us tremendous opportunity. Post 2009 there is tremendous fear of even more fractured coalition. The unspoken fear in the country is even the kind of cohesion that we found so far may elude us in the coming years. And it will almost certainly elude us. Increasingly in many states, because of the caste-based politics that Ms. Ranjita has talked about, many small parties are emerging with local clout without any kind of overall credibility and yet electoral presence, and therefore even in states which earlier had stable governments, we now see an increasing spectre of unstable and unethical coalitions. I'm a great fan of coalitions. I believe that stability for stability's sake is no good at all. Stability of the graveyard sometimes is more dangerous than instability. But unethical coalitions and instability mandated by money power is a very dangerous thing, and that's increasingly happening in the country, and it's more likely to happen in the future. Therefore, I believe there is now a desperate need for the major parties themselves to switch or accept that they are so bound by their own inertia, by business as usual, that they refuse to look at that once they're entrenched in power. Once they're out of power, they're powerless to do anything about it. But I think this vicious cycle must stop. My appeal to you, Mr. Speaker, is this is something that is eminently doable. Recall will not work for the reasons Dr. Tharoor mentioned. In a plural society, it's easy to join hands on caste and other grounds to defeat anybody. And in a country where people are perpetually angry and therefore they want to throw the bums out, the one dominant feeling in the country, except a few pockets of India, is somehow destroy the government of the day, somehow teach them a lesson, somehow send them out. In that prevailing climate, recall appears very nice, but it's not a very elegant solution. It becomes chaotic, it becomes extremely destabilizing, it becomes dysfunctional. Theoretically sound, I have no quarrel with that, but we must recognize the realities of Indian society and politics. And therefore, I don't think there are any technical fixes. I don't think it's a problem that can be solved by training. We require training, no question. I don't think it's a problem that can be solved by another typical middle-class fashion statement that if only there are educational qualifications for members of parliament, as if members of parliament are uneducated. The truth is 85% of them have degrees. And in a country like India, I don't think degree really matters. If a degree really is made a prerequisite, another 15% will definitely get degrees. That's not a big issue. It doesn't change India. The truth is, the current electoral system does not allow space for decent elements to enter politics unless you are the son and daughter of an existing politician, unless you made tons of money, very often illegitimately, sometimes could even be legitimate but unaccounted, and unless you are a criminal. And therefore, bemoaning that politicians are behaving the way they're behaving doesn't really solve a problem. I think we have to look at the electoral system. And one last word, Mr. Speaker, sir, we could have hopefully a more meaningful dialogue rather than this monologue. I'm ashamed of this monologue. The party system. Ms. Ranjita talked about how the party leaders egg them on. Now, if she persistently disobeys her leaders, and in fact, if what she said today is revealed in public, I fear for her political future. There is a realistic chance that she will not be renominated if she is such a rebel in the party. Now, no sane country can allow our best material to be at the mercy of the political leaders, often unelected, anointed, and sometimes anointed by succession, hereditary succession. It's a disgrace to this country. We must, and I passionately believe this, unless you transform political parties, you cannot transform politics of India. Political parties may not be mentioned in the Constitution except in the 10th schedule, but political parties are overwhelming reality. They determine the shape of events. It doesn't matter what you discuss and I discuss in Parliament, frankly. All it matters is 10 people in Parliament, the leaders, they must be convinced. The 2003 law incidentally came about not because Parliament deliberated, or even understood, I dare say, because 10 key people of India, they understood it was in their best interest. They did it. The big changes in India never happened because the Parliament deliberated. I mean no disrespect to India. That's the way we function. We are almost a lawyer jirga. And after the 10th schedule, we actually became a lawyer jirga. It's no longer of any consequence what you discussed there. You have to raise your hands or else you're disqualified. Now, I can understand the 10th schedule, and I'm a great fan of anti-defection provisions. I'm fully in agreement with that. I can understand those provisions being applied when the confidence or no confidence motion is in vogue, or the finance bills, or are the ones debated because the government survival depends on that. But for a Muslim women's bill, for an ordinary bill of parliament, for a nuclear agreement, for something else, how can the parliament function? What is the purpose of the deliberations? We have now constrained too much because we have no faith in our parliamentarians. The party leaders use that very skillfully to tighten the grip over the party members, those in parliament and outside, those in legislation outside. We have to look at 10th schedule, make members of parliament free people who can speak out honestly, even against their own leadership and their views if necessary, except that they should not have the power to undo the mandate of the people. They cannot bring down a government without the sanction of the party or the people themselves. Except that for that one injunction, the members of parliament and legislature, we must give them due respect. One last word, Mr. Speaker. I entirely endorse the committee system, and you mentioned quite rightly that the committees work pretty well. But the committees are not empowered in India. Woodrow Wilson said long ago that Congress in session is Congress on exhibition. Congress in committees is Congress at work, and that's true with our parliament too. But because the committees are not empowered, not adequately empowered, while the committees do extremely valuable work, it is not finding expression in terms of the parliament's overall output. Nor do the members of parliament feel that they have a sense of satisfaction in doing an outstanding job.
Empowerment would help.
So, and in that,
would empowerment help, or all the vices will come into the system?
Sir, I am a great believer in human nature. I believe if you design a system well, give incentives, the best in the human beings will come. After all, our first generation leadership in this country after independence was absolutely unmatched in the world. We are capable of that, and you are a standing testimony to that. So I have no reason to disbelieve that the best will come to the fore if only we create the right conditions. Now, frankly, to be a good member of parliament today, sir, what is the incentive? You get elected after enormous hardship, and in this wretched system, after spending tons of money, you're asked to raise your hands. Occasionally you can speak out. Rarely a speaker like you may pat an MP on the shoulder and say you've done a good job. Otherwise, where is the public esteem? Where is the opportunity to shape events for a member of parliament? Unless you empower the committees, you tell them that you can't vote against your party. You tell them you can't interfere in the executive branch of government because that is no-no. That is improper. You can't telephone to the Thanadar and tell him that, look, release so-and-so, or interfere in a contract for a commission or a tender or whatever, or a transfer of an official. What does the member of parliament or an MLA do? It's all nice for us to say, you should not do this and that. And I'm one of those who keep saying, remove the 2 crore rupees for MPs each year. It's fundamentally wrong. All this is true. But what is the legitimate space for a member of parliament in this country? Or an MLA in this country? If you don't have a legitimate space, if there is vacuum, what happens? Power abhors vacuum. Abuse of power becomes endemic. Therefore, empower them, not only in demand for grants, but also in all public policy matters, in overseeing legislation and its implementation. You have the 1995 law, Delhi Rent Control Act, enacted by the Parliament of this country. Until today, the executive branch of government, despite several successive prime ministers and governments, did not see it fit to implement that law. The law is simply not implemented by the guise of not creating the rules. What kind of a system is this? What self-esteem can a member of parliament have? The parliament has a duty and a right to haul up the executive and say, look, why did you not do it? I want you to do it, and so date. That's the will of the parliament. It's violated by the executive branch of government. Subordinate relations is an excuse to undermine the parliament. Similarly, the key appointments in the country, let there be a process of confirmation by the parliament, or the appointments are suggested by the government, let there be a public hearing. Let there be a confirmation by the members of parliament. Of course, there will be a lot of mess. It will not be worse than today. In my state, in the past 6 months, an honest official was transferred 5 times. There's no point pretending what's happening today is wonderful. It's rotten. Let it come out. Let people debate and discuss. Let members of parliament, citizen assemblies, let them have the opportunity to question this. And there'll be decent people to change this. Then parliament becomes attractive. Assembly becomes attractive. You make it unattractive except by abuse of power. You make honesty incompatible with survival in public life. And then we lament that good people don't come in. Why should Mr. Narayan come into politics? Unless he's insane. In this country, we created such conditions. Some of us are insane. That's why
him to come. He is not insane. And then I want him to...
No, Mr. Speaker, that's the point I'm making. Many of us who are now into politics, I am into politics now and you are into it for the past 40 years, blemishless record, don't allow the conditions to prevail in which a Dr. Manmohan Singh is fit to be Prime Minister of India but cannot be elected to the lower house of Parliament in our wretched electoral system. That is the tragedy of this country. And we're all pretending that that's not the case. If you want the best, you create a system that brings the best. You create incentives by which honesty can be preserved. And it's possible, and happily, it's necessary now. Mr. Speaker, before you demit office, because you have made what I hope is not irrevocable, an irrevocable commitment that you will demit office out of anguish, out of disgust, because you're tired and exhausted, and God knows that you've earned that right to be tired and exhausted. But before you demit office, please make this the central plank. There is a realistic chance of this happening, and this is the window of opportunity for this country. Thank you.
Very much. Yes, last but not the least, Suhas Bolkar, very well-known civil activist. Yes, Sri Bolkar.
Honorable Speaker, sir, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.